Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see so many people here. This is, as you know, one of the Seven Roads Group series of Sunday evening talks, and we've got Jean-Luc here to speak to us about Paris. Well, you know what he's here for. You've seen the poster. I'm sure it'll be. He's French and everything, and you know, and he. And everything, and he was there, and he's written a book about it, which you may not realise because he's got a secret name on it. That's not his name on it, but he did the book. So we're expecting to have a very interesting time, and I know that he is very much welcoming you to join in, ask questions and everything else. But as a matter of detail, he will be speaking for 45 minutes, if he wants to, and then we've got 20 minutes for asking questions, and then you're most welcome to get yourselves another drink or a drink and look at some of the fantastic posters he's got round the sides if you haven't already seen them. The other important thing I need to say, it is our custom is to have a donation box at the back so that when you leave here, you make a donation, if you wish to the charity of the speaker's choice, because he's doing this for us for nothing, and we've asked him to choose a charity, and he has chosen Médecins Sans Without Frontiers, as you know, tongue. And you all know what that is, but anyway, just to remind you, all over the world, anywhere, any kind of conflict, any kind of situation, they go in and they help people with their medical needs. Jean-Luc feels very passionately about that. In fact, his brother was involved in it for quite a long time. And so if you want to give something to that cause, try not to notice that the donation buckets at the back happen to have Union Jacks on them. There are still lovely places to put your money if you wish to. So on that note, could we welcome Jean-Luc?
Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure how many upstanding Seven Roads residents would be interested to hear about revolting French students, albeit the ones of 50 years ago. And it is 50 years, indeed, sadly for some of us, that France experienced a massive political and social upheaval during 2 months in 1968, in May and June of 1968. What started as student protests soon spread to factories and offices and throughout France to many parts of society, to culminate in a deep political crisis which actually threatened the government of the day. So dramatic events which I want to explore tonight in what I've tried to be a fairly visual presentation, using posters of the time, photographs, slogans and graffiti of that period. Out of the chaos of these days, of those days, I should say, I'll try to give you a sense of how the events unfolded, highlighting the trigger point and 3 subsequent turning points of these events. And as I go along, try to throw some light on at least some of the underlying causes, some of the reasons for these events, and then conclude in a few words on the impact that they had on French society, a few words on their lasting legacy. A health warning to start with. I haven't included anything gory or bloody. I could have done, but you will see in some of the photographs a few truncheons hitting a few heads, I'm afraid. So be prepared. And perhaps to echo the spirit of those days, the challenging of the established order, I'm going to start not at the beginning, but halfway through, in fact in the middle of the events. This is a photograph taken on the 29th of May. The event started on the 3rd of May, so we're 4 weeks into the protests. By then, France is at a standstill. There are 10 million people on strike. All the universities are being occupied. There are thousands of factories occupied. Whole cities like Nantes, which is a big city, are being run by strike committees. the government ministries are not working, all the civil servants are on strike. And on that day, the 29th of May, the head of state, who I hope you recognize here, President Charles de Gaulle, has cancelled the cabinet meeting that he holds every Wednesday morning, which in itself is an extraordinary act. But he's also ordered 2 helicopters, and he's asked them officially to take him and his wife to his country house in eastern France. The second helicopter is for his son, his wife, and their children. So de Gaulle is planning to take the whole family. And once up in the air, he tells the pilots, we're not going to my country residence in eastern France. And he tells them to fly low, to avoid radars, and to fly into Germany. And what's more, he sort of orders them not to tell anyone, not even the German authorities. And he's going to Baden-Baden, where there is the headquarters of the French troops, the army troops that were stationed in West Germany in those days still. And the man there, the man in charge, is a general called Massu, who is called by the pilots to be told, de Gaulle is arriving with his whole family, please set up some living quarters for him and his family, which shows that they were actually going there to stay. Now, the intention was to stay anyway. Back in Paris, Georges Pompidou, who is the Prime Minister, is having his mid-morning coffee in his residence, and his wife comes in an agitated way. Now, I wasn't there, obviously, but they've both written about it, so I can tell you what happened. She comes in agitated and she says, George, you won't believe this. I've just had a call from the Élysée Palace from a friend of mine. They haven't told anyone yet, but they don't know where the general is. De Gaulle has disappeared. Now you can imagine the panic. And in fact, they weren't going to know for several hours where he was and what was happening. And the reason I started with this is partly because it is incredible, well, rather incredible, and secondly, because, and more importantly, because it illustrates the depth of the crisis after 4 weeks. So how did we get there? Well, we need to go back in time to the 3rd of May. Friday the 3rd of May is sunny afternoon in Paris. And I was actually, by accident, there on the spot. I was walking back from having gone to a lecture at the university I attended, which was Sciences Po, and I was walking back up the Boulevard Saint-Michel. Now, this is the little square by the Sorbonne. This is the Sorbonne in the background. And this is Place de la Sorbonne. And this is what I should have seen that day as I walked up the Boulevard Saint-Michel. And instead of which, that's what I encountered. The square was packed with policemen and police vans. Now you can see that students were still, well, not just students, but people were ambling peacefully and not seemed to be too bothered by it, but it was a strange scene to come across. And so I and many others around me started sort of finding out what was happening. And what was happening was this. In the courtyard of the Sorbonne, you may recognize some of you may recognize the chap in the middle there holding the microphone. This is Daniel Cohn-Bendit. And the people around him are activists from Nanterre University, which is a new university in the suburbs of Paris, who've come here that day because they were running a campaign at Nanterre to try to get some freedoms and rights which had been denied to them, and one of those rights was holding meetings. And so they came to the Sorbonne as way of countering, what I should say first is that the campaign that they'd carried out for some weeks before this particular day, had led the Vice Chancellor of Nanterre University, someone called the rector in French, to actually close down Nanterre. So as a counter to that, they came and held this meeting in the courtyard of the Sorbonne. And but in fact there were only about 100 of them, and as I said, being rather peaceful there. And yet, what happened next was this. The rector of the Sorbonne, in an extraordinary move, and a big mistake as it turned out, decided to call in the police to get the Nanterre students out of the Sorbonne. This in itself was provocative enough because the Sorbonne was traditionally a place where the police didn't go in. But what followed was actually the unexpected trigger for the whole event. The leaders of the group were told by the police, if you come out, file out, and your papers will be checked, your identity papers will be checked, and you will be free to go. In fact, what happened was that the women were let go, which is rather strange, a sign of these strange backward times. But the men were taken in, were pushed into the police vans and taken to police stations. Now, this was the situation when I arrived on the scene, and by then the students had a big crowd had gathered round. The rector and the police couldn't have chosen a worse time to do this. It was 4 or 5 p.m. in the afternoon. The kids, school kids coming out of the local high schools were joining the students. So there was a big crowd around the square. And people were so outraged by what they found out that they started gathering around the police vans, banging on the sides of the vans, shouting, "Free our comrades," and trying to block the departing vans. Now, French gendarmes only knew one way of responding to this, and that was it. And this, and that. Now, notice that no one at that point had prepared for the demonstration. No one was wearing helmets or protection, as you will see in later demonstrations. There were no agitators, as the government claimed later on. There were no, there were not even student activists there. Only a few of them, perhaps by accident. So it wasn't pre-organized. All the people you see there were ordinary students, young people who just happened to be there. And which in a way made their reaction all the more extraordinary, because on that day, they did not run away from the police and the tear gas, and instead, many of them spontaneously resisted and fought back. Hundreds of students opposed the gendarmes. Large numbers of extra police were called in, were rushed in, and the confrontation lasted until late in the night. By the end of it, the Sorbonne was definitely closed. The police were blocking all access to the Latin Quarter, the area around the Sorbonne, and 600 students had been arrested. The event had set a pattern that was going to be repeated in days to come. Relatively modest, reasonable demands were met by overreaction from the university authorities and violent repression from the state. But what had been significant that afternoon was that, what had exploded on the Boulevard Saint-Michel was what the French call a feeling of ras-le-bol, which can be literally translated as but rather too mildly translated as the cup overflows, but perhaps more accurately as can't take this anymore. A feeling that I thought was rather well illustrated by, I like this photo, by the next photo. So what was behind this, we've had enough, can't take anymore, beyond the sheer outrage at the duplicity of the police on that day? What were some of the underlying causes of these, the reaction of the young people that day? And this is probably one of the most difficult things to convey, as obviously there were many complex reasons. But I'd like to highlight two areas, one objective and the other more subjective, more to do with perception. The first thing is that the baby boomers had arrived. I know you can blame the baby boomers for everything these days, but or the internet, but there was no internet then, so I have to blame the baby boomers. Anyway, they were to blame, but they arrived in huge numbers. The generation that was born after the war, that is, as you know. And the numbers had increased enormously between 61 to 67, 68. By 68, there were 600,000 students in French universities. Just as a comparison, in British, that was 3 times the numbers in British universities. Now, the infrastructure, of course, was not there for them. So the result was a higher education system that was unfit for purpose, packed amphitheaters where students, hordes of students, went to listen to professors giving the same lectures they'd been giving for the last 20 years. No contact with the staff, no seminars, no discussions, no tutoring, and as for pastoral care, nobody had ever heard about that. At the end of the year, you sat for exams and 50% of you failed, and you had to either redo the same year, adding to the numbers of students, or give up, which many people did. So a chaotic, overcrowded, bureaucratic, malfunctioning system through which the students were herded like cattle in increasing numbers. But even more important than this, to explain that burst of anger on the 3rd of May was the perception by most young people of their place in French society, which I think this poster, which was created later in the period, illustrates very well. You'll recognize the big figure there in the background, and the wording says, "Be young and shut up." And remember the blossoming in the UK of youth culture that took place in the early 60s to the mid-60s, the arrival of pop music, the so-called swinging 60s, the permissive society, the end of deference, and to some extent similar events and social changes that took place in the US as well. Some of you may recall the so-called Summer of Love of 1967, which was a bit before this. Well, young people in France were very aware of all these things, but pre-68 France had not experienced any of this, or very superficially, with the arrival of pop music, you could say, which in any case was widely derided and mocked. It may come as a surprise, but pre-68 France was a society that was highly hierarchical, sclerotic, morally repressive, and certainly unpermissive. It was a society where all too often young people were treated as potential moral dissidents, where they were treated as potential subversive that had to be contained and controlled. It was a society where young people were treated for as long as possible as children and not as young adults, where they were expected to conform to strict moral and social codes. And if you transgressed in the slightest, say by having long hair if you were a boy, or by wearing a miniskirt if you were a girl, you could not avoid daily occurrences of being treated with open condescension, derision, and contempt. And let's face it, the French can be quite good at this. And just to be slightly facetious, and to try to conjure up a sense of that feeling, just remember, if you can, your worst experience with a rude cafe waiter in Paris, or a grumpy taxi driver, or a pretty petty, inflexible bureaucrat. And if you remember those feelings, you'll get a sense of what most young people pre-1968 experienced, young people in France, of course I'm talking about, experienced repeatedly in their daily lives. And just to relate it back to the events, I mentioned the Nanterre students. They were called the Movement of 22nd of March, by the way. They'd been campaigning for rights and freedoms, and here were some of the rules in the halls of residence in Nanterre. In bedrooms, no right to move furniture, no right to put up posters, very limited rights to visit across male and female halls of residence, and of course, no right to hold meetings, not even about other things than politics, I mean meetings in general. Just a few TV rooms where you're supposed to engage in worthy activities like go and play chess and cards. So remember, it was protesting for those rights and protesting against such things that led to the closing of Nanterre University, and following that, to the trigger for the whole events. And this next poster, in fact, also captures well what French society was supposed to be like, listening to your master's voice, indeed, via TV news. The poster repurposes the old HMV brand, his master's voice. They made TV sets in France at the time. It was a highly symbolic image of pre-68 France, the figure of the patriarchal leader and a subservient society listening to his words. So the Sorbonne is closed. The Quartier Latin is full of police. 600 students have been arrested. Some of them have been charged already over the weekend in an emergency procedure. 6 of them have been jailed. And so during that weekend, student activists got busy trying to organize a response. Action committees were formed. This newspaper was launched, Action. The headline here neatly answering the previous poster saying, Demain, la parole est à nous, tomorrow, it's our turn to speak. And a demonstration was called for the Monday. Now, given the experience at the time of demonstrations against the Vietnam War, which were quite frequent, nobody expected more than a couple of thousand to turn up. And this is what happened. The events of 3rd of May had tapped into a feeling of ras-le-bol that was far more widespread than anyone had imagined. About 16,000 people turned up, mostly students, but not just, young lecturers, many of them, some trade unionists, and they marched towards the Sorbonne with 3 demands: free the arrested students, reopen the Sorbonne, and take the police out of the Quartier Latin, of the Latin Quarter. Now, Cohn-Bendit had by then become one of the de facto spokespersons of the movement, and he went to meet the rector and the chief of police to try to negotiate. This photo later became emblematic of the spirit of May 68, a cheeky, rather cheerful young man standing up against blind authority. And it was widely used as a poster. A minister had dismissed the protesters as indésirables, hence the slogan here, "We are all undesirables." The talks didn't get anywhere, and so the march reached the Latin Quarter, and rather naively, perhaps stupidly, the students thought that their sheer numbers, there were so many of them, that they thought the police would actually let them through to the Sorbonne. Once again, you see no preparation. Here people weren't wearing helmets or protection. They walked right up to the ranks of the police. Just in passing, I'll point to, perhaps for some of you, a familiar image, a familiar figure of those days, the wannabe Che Guevara there. But see what happens to the poor chap next. The reaction was such that, of course, the Sorbonne didn't get liberated that day. Nor did it in the following days. The authorities were standing firm, so every day there were bigger and bigger demonstrations, from 16,000 on the Monday to that day, which is Friday the 10th, when 30 to 40,000 people came to occupy the Latin Quarter. The student leaders, having obtained nothing from the authorities, came up with the idea that people would occupy the Latin Quarter all night long if necessary, thinking the government would eventually give in. Now that, perhaps, again, with hindsight, a rather naive, rather foolish tactic, but these were rather foolish times in many ways. So by that evening you had 30 to 40,000 demonstrators encircling the ranks of police who were themselves encircling the Sorbonne. And by nightfall, because people were bored and they feared an attack by the police, they started building barricades, and within a couple of hours there were barricades all around the Quartier Latin. Meanwhile, there were still talks taking place. People were listening on the transistor radios for breaking news coming through, but nothing was transpiring in terms of any kind of agreement with the authorities. And later that night, you can see in the balconies there, you can see one or two figures there, but later that night, there were interesting scenes because above the demonstrators, the well-to-do middle-class residents of that area started giving support to the students, throwing water and food to them. It was a first sign of what was to come, that the turning of public opinion against the government's overreaction. Anyway, by 2 a.m., news came that all talks had been abandoned, and a few minutes later, the police charged, 6,000 of them. The clashes lasted for 4 hours. And even in the early mornings of early hours of the morning on Saturday, the police were still rounding up and arresting people. Not surprisingly, hundreds were injured during that night, both amongst the police and the students. And in fact, it was a miracle that nobody was killed. Parisians woke up to scenes of devastation. The shock was enormous throughout the country. It soon became clear, however, that by and large public opinion, as I hinted earlier on, public opinion was actually blaming the government rather than the students. So all the main trade unions seized the opportunity to call for a general strike the coming Monday. And de Gaulle at this point still thought that it was the work of agitators and wanted to send in the army. He wanted to send in the military and said to his prime minister, they can shoot in the air. He treated it as an insurrection. But his prime minister, Pompidou, prevailed. He was a much more sensible man who understood the situation much better than de Gaulle. And finally, late in the day, rather wisely, he attempted to defuse the situation. And on Saturday evening, he gave way on all the three demands of the students. The Sorbonne would reopen on the Monday, the police would evacuate the Latin Quarter, and most importantly, the arrested students would be freed. And so by Monday, you had the biggest demonstration so far, nearly 1 million people, the majority of whom were not students, obviously, but trade unionists and generally people of the left. Anyone opposed to de Gaulle and his right-wing government took to the streets in what could be termed a victory parade. And in a way, things could have stopped there. Things could have ended there. But by the afternoon, the students, determined to press for a radical reform of the education system, went and occupied the Sorbonne, and an extraordinary period opened up, which François rather insightfully and already was calling a cultural revolution. Remember the poster, "Be young and shut up"? Well, from that day on and for several weeks, no one wanted to shut up. Everyone wanted to talk. The French expression that described it best at the time was "La parole est libérée," which meant something like, speaking out is now allowed. And speak out, they all did, in their thousands, in packed amphitheaters, but this time not to listen to old professors, but to listen to each other. In endless debates, night and day, about how to change the education system, how to topple the capitalist consumer society, how to change the world, no less. And sometimes to listen and also to challenge established intellectuals who actually queued up to take part in the discussions. You might just about recognize Jean-Paul Sartre here. And this one, which shows a French poet, Louis Aragon, who had a lively street debate with Cohn-Bendit here. And street debates for several weeks were constant. Discussions took place not only in the Sorbonne itself, but outside on pavements and street corners all over the Quartier Latin, and soon all over France. I witnessed amazing scenes during those days, if not of people undergoing instant conversions, but certainly of profound changes of attitudes, to young people, to politics, to the government, to the way society was organized. There was something in the atmosphere then that made people question themselves and question society in a way that they had never done before. It was a time when radical change seemed possible. So perhaps not surprisingly, we come to the second turning point, which paradoxically did come as quite a surprise to the students at the time. This is the Tuesday morning, and the surprise came from 10 a.m. On the radio news, breaking news interrupting normal programs. And from all over France, there were reports that workers, instead of going back after the one-day strike of the Monday, were actually not going back to work, but going into their places of work and occupying their factories and places of work. And the news came through like a cascade. Every few minutes brought news of new factories being occupied. Factories in the provinces, big factories in Paris. It's interesting to see in passing the demand there, which showed that it wasn't just about money. The banner says, "We want time to live. Let's go back to the 40-hour week." Now, many workers at the time the majority of workers worked 48 hours per week, and in some cases up to 56 hours per week. And from all over France, as I said, from all kinds of places of work, there was news of places of work being occupied by men and women. And I really like this one, which actually shows the exuberance and the energy that was released at the time. This was very much a spontaneous movement from the rank and file, not one called for by unions. They thought they'd done their bit on the Monday, but the young workers, and there were many of them, there were a third of the population was under 21. And it was young workers that were the ones initiating the movement by and large. They'd seen the government giving way to the students' demands, and they thought, well, we can do the same. They too wanted change. from the post-war period of the 1940s to 68 and later, France experienced a massive economic boom, but wages, conditions, working conditions that really lagged behind. I've already mentioned the long hours, but crucially, productivity was being driven by constantly increasing work rates on the assembly lines. In French it's called the cadence, and it was one of the main gripes of the time, that people were made to work more and more faster and faster, and also by strict rules all too often enforced by petty supervisors and foremen. And just as the students had found French society repressive, young workers found life in factories demeaning and oppressive. And of course, the students enthusiastically supported the workers' cause and set about publicizing the conflict. It was the era of the silk screen poster, which you see them being produced, clear line designs, simple big images, pithy slogans. They were to become the symbolic graphic expression of the period. Iconic photographs of strikers were turned into posters, and scary photos of armed gendarmes inspired this particular poster, denouncing the government's control over the TV news. And I have to tell you that at the time there was a Minister of Information who received the main stories, the main headlines, and the stories of the main TV news every day in order to vet them before they went out on the French news. Now, this is also another one showing with wit, press, don't swallow. I'd like to say the Daily Mail, don't swallow, that would be good. And this one, pretty evident for free information. This one denouncing the cadence I was talking about, graphically denouncing the acceleration of the work rates. And a nice one that I think has aged rather well, calling for French workers and immigrant workers to unite. A wave of dissent had washed over France and reached out to many parts of society. I'm just going to run through quickly a few posters that illustrate how broadly the movement spread, and showing that it was in many ways a social liberation movement as much as a traditional workers-employers conflict, and to show the graphic creativity that blossomed during those days. But we start, I suppose, with the usual suspects: the railway workers, the postal workers, the people working on fishing boats, on canal boats, but perhaps less predictably, the journalists of the ORTF being the French BBC, except without the freedom and independence, although I'm not sure we can say that these days. And I don't know if you can still, anyway, they went on strike for the first time ever to demand independence from the state. And again, not very predictable, the employees of the big department stores, the Galeries Lafayette, the Bon Marché, and so on, also walked out. And not to be left behind, the grumpy taxi drivers. And I don't have a poster for the next two, but photographs. Even the football players were touched by the spirit of the time. They occupied the offices of the French Football Federation, and proclaimed "le football aux footballeurs," which I trust doesn't need translating. And the challenging of authority even spread to many unlikely institutions. In this case, the Catholic Church, a couple of revolutionary nuns there. There were lively debates that took place among their clergy and lay people. In fact, all institutions, there were debates of this sort. And to go from one end of the spectrum to the other, and to mention perhaps the most unlikely of all, the can-can dancers of the Folies Bergère cabaret in Montmartre, they were at it as well, so to speak. Now, I've already mentioned that a key feature of that period was a great flourishing of free expression, an inspiring cocktail of humor, poetry, and politics. The movement gave rise to many graffitied slogans, many of which have remained highly symbolic of the events. Here are some of the most famous ones. Imagination has seized power. Ironically, here again, it's one of the most unimaginative and boring cars of the period, but we'll ignore that. The slogans reflected the utopian idealism of the times. Be realistic, demand the impossible, and sometimes with a touch of surrealistic poetry. Under the paving stones, the beach. And often with a libertarian anarchistic streak, it is forbidden to forbid. And a great deal of wishful thinking too. Take your desires for the realities. And you can see a rather witty one next to it, stating the general will, or the will of the people, if you like, although I don't like saying that at the moment, the will of the people. Anyway, the general will against the will of the general. So by the end of May, this collective will, or at least a significant part of it, meant that France, as I've said before, was at a standstill, over 10 million people on strike, the government no longer in full control. On the 24th of May, de Gaulle goes on television and tries to reassert the government's authority, but it falls flat. And in fact, on that very day, in the evening, there's one of the biggest demonstrations of the period in Paris, but one that was unfortunately ended up being one of the most destructive and in the end counterproductive ones. The crowd invaded the Paris Stock Exchange and set fire to it. And this actually marked the beginning of a change. Just as there'd been a change after the 10th of May, there was a change at that point in public opinion, a growing worry, a concern that the country was actually descending into chaos. Now, de Gaulle was still keen, because he didn't understand what was going on, to call on the army. And Pompidou had to talk him out of it once more. De Gaulle wanted to repress, Pompidou wanted to maneuver and try to split the movement. And so, as Pompidou called the unions and the employers, Pompidou is the Prime Minister, just to remind you, he called the unions and employers and government together, and just as he had done with the students, by the 27th of May, he made significant concessions to the unions. The minimum wage went up by 35%. Salaries went up by 10%. A fourth week paid holiday was guaranteed. The 40-hour week was reasserted, and lots of other rights which I don't have time to mention. Now, all of this showing how far behind, in fact, wages and conditions had fallen. Now, these were significant gains, and yet, when the union bosses put them to the rank and file, the next day, a return to work was rejected, and the strikes and the occupations continued. But by then, the crisis had now become deeply political. Opposition parties were on the verge of setting up a provisional government. Another massive demonstration was called for on the evening of that day, of the 29th of May, and was planned to go past the Élysée Palace. And at that point, we're nearest to what could have been an enforced regime change, a seizing of power. And it is at that point, if you remember, it is at that point that de Gaulle decides to disappear. Now, I left you in suspense about the outcome of his flight to Baden-Baden. Well, General Massu, the chap in charge there, spent an hour and a half ensconced in his office with de Gaulle. And at first, de Gaulle is very despondent. He says, I'm going to give up. I want to retire. He says he wants to retire to Ireland, strangely, you know. And Massu says, you can't. You know, you're de Gaulle. You're the savior of the nation. You have to go back. You have to fight back. And eventually, he manages to convince de Gaulle to return to Paris and fight back. He also says to him, promises that if the left-wing parties took over, the army would intervene and would back de Gaulle. Meanwhile, back in France, once they knew that de Gaulle was coming back, his supporters got busy rallying all the right-wing forces of the country and organized a pro-de Gaulle show of strength for the 30th of May. And so we come to the third and final turning point of our story. On the 30th of May, in Paris, de Gaulle makes a radio broadcast, only 4.5 minutes, but unlike in his previous TV intervention where he was looking downhearted, in this case he sounds strong, decisive, combative, starting with a defiant "I will not resign," condemning the chaos and crucially announcing that he was dissolving Parliament and ordering a general election by the end of June, thereby shifting the ground from the streets to the ballot box. The Gaullist party had managed to bring hundreds of coaches from all over France. They were led by, for a big demonstration, led by the ministers and the MPs. You may have, I don't know, some of you may recognize this is Malraux, who is the Minister of Culture. And from all over France, people came to demonstrate on the Champs-Élysées, nearly 1 million people, confirming that not all of France had been radicalized by the events. The tide had turned. The protests, strikes, and occupations continued for another 4 weeks or so. But in view of the approaching elections and the fact that demonstrations became banned because of the election, by the end of June, the protests gradually dwindled and people resumed work. A peaceful evacuation of the Sorbonne signaled the end of the events. The parliamentary election returned a majority for de Gaulle, though not a landslide. It was 47% to the right, 41% to the left, a result which the students, with bitter disappointment, marked with this poster: return to normality. But in fact, was it really a return to normality? What were the lasting legacies of these dramatic events? Politically, in the short term, not much changed. The political system remained the same people stayed in power. But although de Gaulle won that particular electoral battle, in a way he lost the war. His authority was fatally damaged, and by the following April, he resigned following a referendum that he lost. In the longer run, the events led to the unification of the parties of the left, which enabled much later, in fact you had to wait 13 years for this, enabled the election of François Mitterrand. But it is socially and culturally that the change was most profound. In many ways, the May 68 events gave voice to the voiceless, and that voice has resonated down the generations to become an integral part of the cultural fabric of French society. The events brought in a great liberalization of social mores. It was for France similar to the social changes that I've referred to before that took place in Britain earlier on, and of course, typically with far less conflict. It was the end of deference for France and all that went with it. It marked the end of submission to rigid social and moral norms of behavior. Later, the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation, the ecological movements of the 70s in France were direct heirs to May 68. And more directly, the education system was reformed indeed, and students were given new rights and were allowed to participate in the running of universities, seminars and continuous assessment were introduced. Schools allowed pupils unions, and just to give a couple of small examples of specific changes that will give an idea of the type of things that changed. Schools allowed girls to wear trousers for the first time, and primary teachers were encouraged to organize trips, excursions for their pupils. Now, that had never been heard of before. All things, a lot of the other things which I haven't got time to list, but which showed that how far behind France had been before May 68. It was a defining moment for French society, and it was a defining moment in French modern history, I would say. A moment when I believe France became a far less rigid, far freer society. Now, I hope I haven't romanticized these events too much. In many ways, they were difficult and often violent times. Times that split the country, times that split, in many cases, split families. But perhaps I may be allowed to end on an upbeat note, a good personal memory. On the 24th of May, I was taking part in one of the biggest demonstrations when we heard that Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was German, by the way, I mean, he was both French and German, but his passport was German. We heard that Daniel Cohn-Bendit had been banished from France and appallingly had been referred to by a minister as a German Jew. I will never forget the feeling of hearing tens of thousands of voices spontaneously responding to this news by chanting, "We are all German Jews." That was a great feeling of collective solidarity, which has stayed with me. So to paraphrase an English poet, I'm sure you'll recognize, his words actually written about the outset of the real French Revolution. There were mornings during that time when it was bliss to be alive, and certainly to be young was very heaven. Thank you very much.
We now have time for questions.
Hello. Thank you very much, Jean-Luc. I went to Paris in September. I couldn't go in June because everything was on strike, and I was supposed to be registering at Saint-Cyr. But the university was still on strike till the following February. Is that right? Does that concur with what you found out?
Yes, I mean, things didn't sort of just settle after. I mean, I said things dwindled, but for months after there were aftermath. There was aftermath of the Troubles and certainly disruption.
But I found that things hadn't really, sort of, from what you say. I mean, I remember when I enrolled. Sorry, I'm talking French. When I enrolled, there were, oh God, I can't remember how many students on our course. But by the end of the year, 50% of them had been chucked out. And then I enrolled in the second year. I got through with, I don't know how, but by the third year, another 50% had got chucked out. So, I mean, in that respect, I mean, I don't know whether that concurs with what you said.
Yes.
I mean,
exactly.
But I mean, you were at the Sciences Po, weren't you?
Well, at first, but unfortunately, because of the events, and without going into too much personal detail, I couldn't carry on at Sciences Po after May 68.
Oh dear, naughty boy. Okay.
So I was at the Sorbonne after that.
Just wonder whether you might be able to say anything about how the movement in France infected other areas, such as UK and other countries around Europe. Because at the time I was in May, I was a revolting student in Hull, and we were sitting in during the very same time for student representation on the university, and we had a telegram from Danny Cohn-Bendit congratulating us on our action. And so there was great cheers went up. And well, it was a very minor thing compared to what you've just discussed. I wonder how widely there was a sort of infection of the spirit in other places.
Yes. Strangely enough, I was part of a small group of students who were invited by the NUS in September, I think it must have been, to come and talk to to students' unions in various universities, and especially in the north. So I did have that contact with people who were active in all those universities. I can't say that Parisian students were particularly, I mean, there was so much going on that it wasn't a priority, if you like, to sort of, try to reach out to other places. There was just too much going on. But certainly there was an awareness of this. And perhaps what I should say is with the link with Britain, I'll tell you what the link with Britain amongst my generation, because it sort of plugs into something which I always get terribly upset about, and I think the misconception that people have here about how the British have about the French and the French, the attitude of the French towards the British. I'm always amazed by it, because for my generation, we loved the British, and the previous generation also loved the British because of the war, and we love the British because of the link with what I referred to in my talk, which was this feeling that Britain was a much freer society, which it was. And many, many of us had come to England as part of school trips and school exchanges, and we were amazed. We came to a country where you could have long hair, where boys met girls. That was astonishing. And it was just so it doesn't quite answer your question, but there was a link there with a generation that had looked at Britain, and also because of the music and everything else, as a beacon of something much better than where we were. So, I don't know, it doesn't quite answer it, but it links to it. I think Gordon was trying to... Oh, sorry, go on. I'll come back in a minute. Somebody's got the...
I think there's some parallels between the late 60s in France and what we're seeing now in UK and America and other countries, with an older, more right-wing generation in power standing in the way of progress that a younger generation would like to see. And we're seeing a lot of protests again. What advice would you give to my generation who are trying to bring about more social revolution, and we're facing barriers like in America yesterday of the confirmation of Black Kavanaugh, that sort of sentiment?
Well, yes, I think it'd be perhaps a bit presumptuous of me to give advice, especially to my own son. But I would say that some of the things that have happened in recent years, in a way, give direction, and should inspire people for what can be done. Grassroots. I think grassroots organization is the main thing, and I think if you see, I hesitate to go into this area, but if you see the way in the last few months that some of the single issue organizations have organized and what they've been pushing for. I mean, a few years back, 38 Degrees, some of you may know, but in more recent months, look at the way the People's Voice campaign has gone. I mean, 2 years ago, when some of us started saying, we would want to have another go at deciding whether we really want to leave the European Union, look at where we are now, it has progressed massively, perhaps not enough, but this kind of grassroots mobilization is much easier. And of course, you have a great advantage over us, a great advantage over us. You have social media. And that is fantastic. That is fantastic.
I'd like to make a contrast. I was at the Sorbonne before coming to Oxford as an undergraduate. I escaped from my boarding school where you had to have your hair cut if it touched your collar. And you had to march out in front of the headmistress. And if your hair was touching your collar, it had to be cut. And I was told I'd be selfish to go to university. I'd be depriving a more worthy person of a place. So I escaped to the Sorbonne, and I found absolute intellectual freedom. I was allowed to read books. I was allowed to walk down the Boulevard Saint-Michel without an escort. And I was allowed to be an intellectual. And I got into Oxford thanks to the Civilisation Française. But when I was staying at the hostel in Paris, unlike St. Hilda's here, in St. Hilda's your bed was checked every morning to see if you'd slept in it. And I wasn't allowed even to go to London to my mother's to hear a lecture by Margaret Mead, because you had to get permission from the principal to be 25 miles out of Oxford. And so I was inspired by the French celebration of intellectuals. And then my final point is that after the 68 thing, there were invasions of the LSE. They were inspired. The London School of Economics was inspired by the 68.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good contrasting. Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely.
Thinking of events before 1968, the state of France, the defeat in the Second World War, the war in Algiers, the war in Indochina.
Yeah.
So what was the atmosphere in France as a result of these events?
Well, I think that's a good thing to comment on, that because of these events that you mentioned, I don't know if everyone heard the post-war situation in France, the war in Indochina, the Algerian War, etc. You could say that actually contributed to the type of society that I described earlier on, a society that was sclerotic, that just wanted to stop and be subservient and conformist, if you like. It was a reaction in some ways to these events, a society where you were grateful to de Gaulle for what he'd done in the war, that he had unified the country, and that we were now, France was now out of the troubles of the Algerian War, the economy was growing, etc. So you had that feeling of a society that didn't want to stir anything, and that's true. It was because of those events that there was that feeling of conforming and not upsetting anything.
Another small point, I was in Grosvenor Square in 1968. The significant thing, there was no overreaction by the police or the government. The reaction was fairly mild.
Exactly. But you see, that if the reaction had been mild, none of these events would have taken place. I mean...
The revolution wouldn't have taken place either.
No, quite.
From my point of view, I was an undergraduate in 1968, well, autumn 68, February 69, I think that we had it sit-in in the Clarendon. And I remember that vividly, and Berit and I were there, and the main discussion I remember is trying to work out why we were sitting in. We knew we had to sit in because we were proper students, but the main issue is what was it we were worrying about? Apart from having secret files, which we all talked about, we couldn't understand what it was. And the other thing I found your talk fantastically interesting, because we didn't know, I mean, others might know, but we didn't know what the French were sitting in about.
Yeah.
We didn't understand. You put it very well. We didn't understand anything.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Somebody at the back.
A quick question just to sort of complete the story. De Gaulle fell after the referendum, but I can't for the life of me remember what it was about.
Yeah, I kind of left that because it's it's a little bit boring. It was a decentralization project, which in itself, I mean, the principle of decentralization for France was a very good one. It should have had support, but it was a rather complicated one, and it was one that people didn't understand, and it upset a lot of the local sort of the people who'd been the local politicians, and therefore there was a big campaign against it. And de Gaulle by then had run out of stamina, run out of of his own sort of momentum, if you like. It was a little bit like the end of Thatcher. It got to the point where everybody was fed up with him. So they lost. He lost. And in a fit of pique, he didn't have to resign, but he used that as a way of saying, well, if that's the way you're going to treat me, I'm going to go off to Colombey des Églises again and wait for you to call me back, which is the pattern of his, I'll tell you one small anecdote about, because it sort of throws quite a lot of light on French society, and it's one I love. It's about Madame de Gaulle. Yvonne de Gaulle was a very strict and rather sort of highly moralistic sort of person. And she went on that day, on the 29th of May, when they left, when de Gaulle decided to pack up and go to Germany. The day before, Madame de Gaulle went out with her driver in the official car, went out to do something, and at a traffic light, another car stopped by her car, and the chap in the car shouted something rude. Now, we don't know what he shouted, because she never said. She said it was too rude to sort of recount. So he shouted something at her, maybe about de Gaulle, about her. And she went back to the Élysée Palace and said to Charles, by the way, they said vous to each other. I don't know if you know what I mean there. So she said, vous ne pouvez pas imaginer ce qu'on m'a dit aujourd'hui. You can't imagine what I was... So she recounted this story, and she said, this man was incredibly rude to me. And what's more, he was driving a Citroën DS. And basically, she could not believe that anyone, and that's a posh car in those days, she couldn't believe that somebody of that status, which is what she believed in, of course, the whole thing of status, that somebody of that status would actually be, and of course that she wouldn't be respected as she expected to be. Now, some people say it was the final straw for de Gaulle, and he decided that night, we have to leave. I'll go and retire to Ireland. Now, I don't know if it's apocryphal. I know the story about the car, the rudeness is not apocryphal. I don't know whether it had influence on de Gaulle to decide to leave. The other, sorry, if I may, the other one, which is very interesting, is the grandchildren of de Gaulle, the ones he took away with him, with the father and anyway, the whole family. The grandchildren were by then 15, 16. And when he took them away, which was on the 29th of May, they'd already been around, these kids. They'd gone out and they'd gone into the Sorbonne. They'd gone and looked at what was happening. And de Gaulle didn't know about that. They wouldn't have dared to say, And apparently when they were having a meal, de Gaulle said to them, what do you young people want anyway? And so they said, well, we want to be free. We want to be free to think for ourselves. We want to live differently. And de Gaulle said, what am I supposed to do about this? And had no idea and no concept of what was going on, really. Just couldn't get it, even when his grandchildren were trying to. And the grandchildren said, of course, we couldn't go much further than that. He knew asked us, what do you want me to do? And we couldn't tell him. He wouldn't have, accepted that.
I think this attitude was also prevalent in the UK. I remember we were living in Colchester. My husband was at the University of Essex, and the press were there every day reporting on what was happening. We heard from the University of York that exactly the same things were happening, but it was much further away. So the journalists couldn't get down in time to get home again. One has to put these things in context.
Yeah,
Clearly, de Gaulle was a big man, and probably there were lots of people who wanted to pull him down. And he had no idea he'd become so self-important.
Yes.
But
Yes.
things have a number of explanations and a number of
Sure.
a number of shades.
Yes. Good
So
point.
I don't think it was all fine here either.
No. But for us, it was a contrast when we came and.
Don't be ridiculous. Of course, it was fine here. Everything was fine here. Anyway, I must say, my take home. I say this for myself. Anybody much older than me, much younger than me, my age, but especially the ones younger than me. I think the take home to Jean-Luc's son is that taking action, trying, has got to be worth it. Because you never know where the tipping points are. You never know. You never know whether it's the EasyJet hotel down the road or whether it's stopping a war or whether it's changing how Europe does things. You don't know. And I really thank you. For me, the picture was, it's just a few blokes, wasn't it? A couple of ordinary-looking blokes at the beginning who weren't allowed in there, so they popped over there and had a natter in the car park or whatever it was. That's what it started with. And I really thank you for reminding us of that.